The neon sign above Carter's corner store flickered erratically, barely cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the quiet street. It was well past midnight, and Jerome Carter sat behind the counter, flipping through the pages of an old military journal. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound accompanying him in the stillness of the night. Jerome had seen many battles in his life, but none had prepared him for the war he faced at home. A retired Marine colonel, he had served his country for over 2 decades, leading men into conflicts overseas, making split-second decisions that determined life or death. He had faced enemies in the deserts of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, and the jungles of Southeast Asia. But the battles of war were nothing compared to the fight for dignity that he endured as a black man in America. His store was his new battlefield. After leaving the military, he had used his savings and pension to buy this small convenience store in a struggling neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. He had spent years building trust with the locals, families who relied on him to provide affordable groceries, kids who stopped by for candy after school, and elders who chatted with him about the changing times. A loud bang outside made Jerome sit up, his instincts kicking in immediately. He reached under the counter where he kept a Glock 19, an old habit from his time in the military. He didn't grab it, not yet, but the mere knowledge of its presence reassured him. Then, the door swung open with a force that made the bell above it jingle violently. 4 uniformed officers walked in, led by Lieutenant Patrick Sullivan. Jerome recognized him instantly, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp jawline, cold blue eyes, and an arrogance that preceded him. Sullivan had a reputation in the neighborhood, and it wasn't a good one. He and his squad, Doug Reynolds, Mike O'Connor, and Kyle Draper, were notorious for shaking down black business owners, making up violations, and taking what they pleased. Jerome kept his expression calm. "Officers, what can I do for you tonight?" Sullivan took his time, strolling down the aisle, running a hand across the shelves. "Routine check," he said casually. Jerome clenched his jaw. Routine check. He had heard this before. Behind him, Reynolds smirked, stepping up to the counter. "You got your business license handy?" Jerome didn't move. "You checked it last month." O'Connor, the heaviest of the bunch, snorted. "We need to see it again." Jerome exhaled slowly and reached under the counter, pulling out the framed license. He set it on the counter. Sullivan glanced at it but didn't bother reading. Instead, he walked toward the refrigerated section and grabbed a cold bottle of whiskey. He twisted off the cap, took a sip, and set it back on the shelf. Jerome's hands balled into fists under the counter. "You gonna pay for that?" Sullivan smirked. "You gonna make me?" The tension in the room thickened. Jerome had faced men like Sullivan before, bullies who abused their power, who relied on fear and intimidation. But he wasn't just another scared shopkeeper. He had killed men in combat, fought to protect his brothers in arms. He knew fear intimately, and he knew when a man was worth fearing. Sullivan was not. Still, Jerome forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't about to give them an excuse to escalate. Reynolds walked behind the counter, opening the cash register. "Looks like you're doing well, Carter." "Maybe too well." Jerome grabbed Reynolds' wrist in a flash. "You don't touch my register." Reynolds' smirk disappeared. "Take your hand off me." Sullivan's hand hovered over his holstered gun. "Careful now," he said, his voice deceptively smooth. Jerome looked him dead in the eye. "Then let go. You want something? Take it and get out." Sullivan laughed, as if amused. He leaned over the counter. "That's the problem with your kind, Carter. You don't know your place." Then, with a swift motion, he reached into the register and grabbed a wad of cash. Jerome's muscles tensed, but he didn't move. Sullivan pocketed the money, then patted Jerome on the shoulder. "Consider this a donation," he whispered. They turned and walked out. Laughing as they did, the door swung shut behind them, leaving Jerome standing in silence, his heart pounding with rage. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. Jerome stood behind the counter, his hands pressed flat against the cold surface, his mind racing, his heart thumped like a war drum, and his breaths came slow and measured. He forced himself to count backward from 10, a trick he had learned in the military to suppress the urge to act on impulse. The injustice of it all burned like acid in his veins. He had fought for this country, bled for it, watched friends die for it, and yet, Here he was, robbed in his own store. Not by criminals, but by the very people sworn to protect and serve. The security cameras. He rushed to the back room, where the surveillance monitors displayed a grainy black and white feed of the store. He rewound the footage, watching as Sullivan and his goons swaggered in, took what they wanted, and left. He watched it again, and again. Each time, his anger deepened. His wife, Lisa, entered the back room. She had been asleep upstairs but had woken when she heard the commotion. "What happened?" she asked, her voice groggy but alert. Jerome clenched his fists. Sullivan and his men. Lisa's face paled. "Again?" He nodded. "This time, they robbed the register." She sank into a chair, shaking her head. "Did you call internal affairs?" Jerome let out a bitter chuckle. "And say what? That a gang of racist cops shook me down? They'll sweep it under the rug. They always do." Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. "So what do we do?" Jerome stared at the screen, at Sullivan's smug face frozen in time. "We fight back," he said. Lisa tensed. "Jerome? I'm not talking about violence." He turned to her, his jaw set in determination. "I'm talking about justice." Lisa searched his face, seeing the man she had married, the warrior, the leader, the protector. She sighed. "Just be careful." Jerome nodded. He would be careful. But Sullivan had just made the worst mistake of his life. The world outside was quiet. But inside Jerome Carter's mind, a storm raged. He sat in his dimly lit back office, staring at the surveillance footage of Sullivan and his men robbing his store. He rewound it, played it back, then paused at the moment Sullivan sneered and stuffed the stolen cash into his pocket. He zoomed in on their faces, memorizing every smirk, every gesture. These weren't just corrupt cops, they were predators. And they had been preying on his community for years. The question was, how many others had they done this to? Jerome wasn't about to let it slide. Not this time. He reached for his old notebook, the one he used in the military for strategic planning. He flipped open a fresh page and started writing down everything he knew about Lieutenant Patrick Sullivan and his team. Patrick Sullivan, age 38, former military police, quick temper, known for aggressive policing in Black and Latino communities. Doug Reynolds, the coward, always following Sullivan's lead, no backbone. Mike O'Connor, the brute, prefers force over logic, enjoys exerting power. Kyle Draper, the smart one, doesn't say much but observes everything. Jerome needed to find out where they lived, what they did off-duty, who they answered to. He didn't just want to fight back, he wanted to dismantle them. At exactly 2 a.m., dressed in dark clothing, Jerome left his store, blending into the shadows of the city. His training took over, silent steps, controlled breathing, always aware of his surroundings. He knew these streets well. And more importantly, he knew how to disappear in them. First stop, Sullivan's house. Jerome had done his research. The lieutenant lived in a gated community, a stark contrast to the struggling neighborhoods he harassed daily. But a fence and a security camera weren't enough to stop a Marine with reconnaissance training. From a distance, Jerome watched Sullivan's house through binoculars. The officer's large SUV was parked outside, its tires covered in dirt, possibly from some off-the-books business. The lights inside the house flickered, and Jerome could make out the silhouette of Sullivan drinking alone in his living room. A man like him? Drinking alone? Interesting. Jerome took mental notes. He wasn't here to act, just to observe, to study weaknesses. For the next 2 hours, he moved between locations, checking out Reynolds, O'Connor, and Draper. O'Connor lived in a rundown apartment, while Reynolds stayed in a modest suburban home. Draper, the quiet one, had an expensive condo, too expensive for a regular officer's salary. That was the lead Jerome needed. Someone was paying them under the table, and he was going to find out who. Jerome returned to his store just before dawn, the air still crisp from the night. He locked the doors behind him and sat down at the counter, staring at the notes he had gathered. They weren't just shaking down small business owners. They were on someone's payroll, the kind of dirty money that didn't come from a police salary. But he needed proof. He couldn't just take them down with fists, he needed their crimes exposed, their careers ruined, and if the system wouldn't hold them accountable, then he'd make sure the streets did. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Marcus." Jerome smirked. "Still awake at this hour?" A chuckle. I don't sleep much. And neither do you. Apparently. Marcus, Ghost Evans was one of Jerome's closest brothers in arms. A former Marine Force recon operative who specialized in intelligence gathering. If there was dirt on Sullivan and his crew, Marcus would find it. I need some information, Jerome said. Who's the target? Jerome hesitated for a beat. Dirty cops. They hit my store. The line went silent. Then, Marcus exhaled. You're serious about this? You know I am. Another pause. Then Marcus responded. All right, give me names. I'll dig. Jerome gave him the details. Every name, every observation. Marcus listened without interruption, then said, This is going to get ugly. Brother. Then it gets ugly, Jerome replied. Marcus laughed. Damn, I missed this side of you. You never saw this side of me. Jerome said. Not yet. Hanging up, Jerome felt the old fire reignite inside him. It wasn't just about his store anymore. It was about justice. It was about sending a message. Sullivan and his men had no idea what was coming. And by the time they realized, it would be too late. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Jerome Carter's small apartment above his store, casting golden slashes of light across the wooden floor. Lisa sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, her expression clouded with concern. She knew that look in Jerome's eyes, the same look he had when he was preparing for a mission overseas. You didn't sleep, she said softly. Jerome shook his head. Didn't need to. Lisa sighed, taking a sip of coffee before setting the cup down. Jerome, I know what you're thinking. And I know you're not gonna stop. But you need to be careful. These men aren't just thugs on the street. They're the law. If you go at them head on, they'll bury you before you even get a chance to fight back. Jerome sat across from her, resting his arms on the table. That's why I'm not going at them head on. Not yet. Lisa narrowed her eyes. What are you planning? Jerome leaned back, exhaling through his nose. They think they're untouchable. But men like that always make mistakes. I just need to find the right one. A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. Jerome instinctively tensed, his mind flashing to the gun in the drawer nearby. But when he opened the door, it was Marcus, Ghost Evans, standing there with a grim smile, wearing a plain hoodie and jeans. Long time, brother, Marcus said, stepping inside. Lisa nodded at him before leaving the two men alone. She knew better than to stand in the way when warriors were planning a battle. Marcus dropped a flash drive on the table and pulled out his phone. I did some digging, and you were right. Sullivan and his crew? They're not just dirty, they're filthy. The kind of dirty that gets people killed. Jerome plugged in the drive and opened the files. His eyes scanned through bank transactions, photographs, and surveillance footage. Holy shit, he muttered. Marcus crossed his arms. Sullivan's been working with a crime syndicate. The kind that deals in drugs, weapons, and anything else that can make a quick buck. He's been their enforcer, making sure the streets stay clear for business. And in return, they pay him well. Jerome clicked through more files, his jaw tightening. And what about the others? They're in on it, Marcus confirmed. But Sullivan is the ringleader. The others just follow his lead. Jerome's mind was racing. We need more than just this. We need them caught red-handed. Marcus smirked. That's why I came here. I got a plan. And as he laid it out, Jerome felt the fire inside him burn hotter. The war had begun. Night had settled over the city, the streets humming with the quiet rhythm of neon signs and distant sirens. Jerome and Marcus sat in an unmarked car, parked across from a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a known meeting spot for drug deals, one of the many operations Sullivan's syndicate ran under the radar. Marcus handed Jerome a pair of binoculars. You see them? Jerome adjusted the focus, watching as Sullivan and O'Connor stepped out of a black SUV, shaking hands with a group of men dressed in dark clothing. A duffel bag exchanged hands. Money. No doubt. Gotcha, Jerome muttered. Marcus grinned. And that's not even the best part. He pulled out a high-powered camera, snapping photo after photo, recording everything. This is all we need, Marcus said. Proof that Sullivan's dirty. We leaked this to the right people. And he's done. Jerome wasn't so sure. Sullivan's careful. If we don't hit him the right way, he'll spin it. He'll say it was part of an undercover operation. Marcus smirked. That's why we get a little more hands-on. Jerome turned to him, eyebrows raised. I'm listening. Marcus tapped the dashboard. They're making another exchange in 2 nights. This time, we make sure it doesn't go as planned." Jerome's lips curled into a smile. It was time to make their move. The abandoned lot behind an old mechanic shop was the perfect spot, isolated. No cameras, no witnesses. The kind of place where bad men thought they could do bad things without consequences. Jerome and Marcus had been waiting for over an hour, hidden in the shadows, watching the area through night vision scopes. Sullivan's SUV pulled up first, headlights slicing through the darkness. O'Connor stepped out first, scanning the area. Then Sullivan followed. Moments later, another car arrived, their contact from the syndicate. The deal started smoothly, money for drugs. A simple exchange. Then, everything changed. Boom! A controlled explosion went off in the distance, causing a massive distraction. Sullivan's crew immediately pulled their weapons, shouting orders. The deal was falling apart. Jerome and Marcus moved fast, slipping through the chaos, snapping photos and recording conversations. "This isn't what we agreed on," the syndicate man growled. "Relax," Sullivan snapped. "We're handling it." Marcus zoomed in, capturing Sullivan's face mid-argument. Bingo! But before they could leave, someone spotted them. "Hey, who the hell is that?" Gunfire erupted. Jerome and Marcus sprinted into the shadows, bullets whizzing past their heads. They leapt over fences, cut through alleyways, using every trick they knew to disappear into the city. By the time the dust settled, Sullivan and his men were left standing in a ruined deal, pissed off and paranoid. And Jerome? He had everything he needed. The next morning, Sullivan was furious. Jerome watched from his store's security feed as the officer pulled up outside, his face red with rage. Lisa tensed beside him. "This isn't good." Jerome kissed her forehead. "Stay upstairs. Let me handle this." He stepped outside, arms crossed, as Sullivan stormed up to him. "You think you're smart?" Sullivan spat. "You think you can play games with me?" Jerome remained calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sullivan grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close. "Listen to me, you son of a bitch. You don't want to start a war with me." Jerome didn't flinch. He let Sullivan see something in his eyes, something dangerous, something cold. "I've already been in wars, Sullivan," he said, voice steady, "and I survived every single one." Sullivan hesitated, just for a moment. Then, he shoved Jerome back and stormed off. Jerome exhaled, watching him leave. Lisa came out, worried. "Jerome, what do we do now?" Jerome turned to her, a slow smirk forming. "We finish what we started." Because now? The hunt was on. The city never truly slept. But at 3:47 a.m., the streets were quiet enough for Jerome Carter to feel the pulse of something big coming. He crouched on the rooftop of an abandoned building overlooking an old warehouse near the docks. His eyes locked on a black SUV pulling up to the entrance. Marcus lay beside him, peering through the scope of a high-powered camera. "They're here," he muttered. Jerome didn't respond. His breathing was steady, his body still, years of training kicking in. Below, the warehouse lights flickered on, illuminating a group of men stepping out of their vehicles. Lieutenant Patrick Sullivan led the pack. He wore his usual plainclothes cop attire. But Jerome knew better. This wasn't police business. This was something darker. Sullivan barked orders as he and his men secured the perimeter. Moments later, another group arrived, 5 men, all dressed in black, carrying heavy duffel bags. Marcus zoomed in. "Weapons," he whispered. "High-grade stuff. These aren't street thugs." Jerome exhaled slowly. He had them. This wasn't just corruption. This was a major arms deal happening right under the city's nose, orchestrated by a dirty cop. Jerome pulled out a small radio transmitter. "Phase 1 begins now," he whispered. A few blocks away, a silent alarm tripped, an old trick Marcus had wired into the system earlier. It pinged the police dispatch, flagging a possible break-in at the docks. Jerome and Marcus waited. 10 minutes passed. Then, sirens. Sullivan turned abruptly, eyes narrowing as flashing blue and red lights bounced off the warehouse walls. "Shit," one of his men cursed. "Abort," Sullivan growled. "Everyone out, now." Panic set in. The armed men scrambled, shoving duffel bags back into their vehicles, trying to erase evidence. But Jerome and Marcus weren't done yet. Jerome lifted his military-grade drone and activated its recording feed, capturing everything: faces, license plates, the exchange of money, hard proof. Sullivan and his crew barely made it out before the first patrol car arrived. But Jerome knew it wouldn't matter. The damage was already done. Tonight, the game had changed. Sunlight streamed through the cracked blinds of Carter's corner store. But Jerome was too busy watching the news to care. Breaking news. Possible illegal arms trade intercepted at city docks. Police investigating. Marcus leaned back against the counter, sipping black coffee. It's working, he murmured. Jerome exhaled, setting down the remote. Not enough. Sullivan still walks free. Lisa emerged from the back room, arms crossed. And what happens when he figures out you're behind this? Jerome met her gaze. He already knows. As if on cue, the store phone rang. Jerome picked up, saying nothing. A familiar voice snarled on the other end. You're making a mistake, Carter. Sullivan. Jerome gripped the phone tighter but kept his voice calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Sullivan laughed darkly. I'll say this once. You back off, or you'll regret it. A click, and the line went dead. Marcus glanced at Jerome. He's scared. Jerome shook his head. No, he's desperate. And desperate men did dangerous things. It started with the fire. Jerome woke to the sound of Lisa screaming. He sprang out of bed, his instincts kicking in before his mind caught up. Thick black smoke filled the stairwell. Flames licked the walls of their store below. Lisa clutched their daughter, Kayla, her face pale with terror. We had to get out. Jerome moved fast, his mind calculating the fastest exit routes. Through the back door? No, flames were already there. The second-story window. Jerome grabbed a blanket, tied it around Kayla's waist, and lowered her down first. Lisa followed, landing on the pavement outside as the store burned behind them. Marcus pulled up in his car, his face twisted in fury. Jesus Christ. Jerome turned to Lisa. Get Kayla to safety. Lisa hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into Marcus's car. Jerome stared at the flames, his chest heaving. This wasn't just a threat. This was war. 3 days passed. The police barely investigated the fire. No arrests. No real effort to find the culprit. Because Jerome already knew who it was. Sullivan had made his move. Now, it was Jerome's turn. Marcus handed him a small USB drive. Everything we got, bank statements, wire transfers, photos from the docks, video proof, enough to sink him. Jerome nodded, his mind already set. But taking Sullivan down through legal means wasn't enough. He needed him to suffer. That night, Jerome parked outside Sullivan's house. Watching, the lieutenant arrived home late, unaware that he was being hunted. Jerome followed at a distance, waiting. When Sullivan finally stepped into his driveway, Jerome moved, fast, silent, precise. A knife pressed against Sullivan's throat before he could even react. Burning my store was a mistake, Jerome whispered. Threatening my family was worse. Sullivan froze. His cocky demeanor vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. You're making a mistake, Sullivan rasped. Jerome leaned in. So did you. Then, with one swift motion, Jerome knocked him out cold. When Sullivan woke up, he was in the trunk of his own car. And the night was far from over. The war wasn't just about justice anymore. Now, it was personal. Sullivan woke up groggy, his head pounding like a drumbeat. The last thing he remembered was walking up his driveway. And then, nothing. Now, his body ached, his wrists tied behind a metal chair, his ankles bound to the legs. He tried to move but found himself completely immobilized. The air smelled of oil and rust. And when his vision cleared, he realized he was in a warehouse, some abandoned place on the edge of the city. A single hanging bulb flickered above him, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Then he saw him. Jerome Carter stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Sullivan had seen men like him before, soldiers. Men who had stared into death's eyes and didn't flinch. But this wasn't a war zone. This was the real world, where cops like Sullivan made the rules. Or at least, that's what he had always believed. You son of a bitch. Sullivan spat, testing his restraints. You don't know who you're messing with. Jerome stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like a predator who had already decided the fate of its prey. I know exactly who I'm messing with, Jerome said, his voice calm. A coward, a dirty cop who hides behind a badge, terrorizing his own people. Sullivan let out a laugh, though there was no humor in it. You think this changes anything? I've got friends in the force. You kill me, they'll bury you so deep no one will ever find your body. Jerome crouched, bringing his face inches away from Sullivan's. I don't need to kill you, he said, I just need you to start talking. Sullivan sneered. About what? Jerome pulled out a USB drive and held it up. About this. About all the money you've taken. The drugs. The weapons deals. And more importantly, about who else is involved. Sullivan's smirk faltered for the briefest second. You don't scare me, he muttered. Jerome nodded as if he had expected that answer. Then, without warning, he grabbed the back of Sullivan's chair and tilted it backward, forcing Sullivan off balance. The chair teetered on two legs. The bound officer now staring up at the ceiling, his weight shifting dangerously close to falling over. You know what happens when a man is tied to a chair and dropped from a height? Jerome asked. The impact doesn't kill him. It just shatters every bone in his legs. Sullivan's breathing quickened. All right, he hissed. All right, I'll talk. Jerome let the chair settle back down. He pulled out a recorder and pressed play. Start from the beginning, Jerome said, and don't leave anything out. And Sullivan did. For the next 2 hours, Sullivan talked. He detailed years of corruption, from small-time extortion to large-scale deals with criminal syndicates. He named officers, higher-ups, even local politicians who were on the take. The police force wasn't just dirty, it was rotten to the core. Jerome listened to every word, letting the recorder capture it all. So you're telling me the chief of police knows about this? Jerome asked. Sullivan scoffed. Knows about it? He's the one running it. You think a few street cops like me could pull off something this big? Jerome exhaled slowly. He had expected corruption, but not this deep. Marcus had been listening in from the shadows. So what's the play now? He asked. Jerome pocketed the USB drive. We expose them. Sullivan chuckled. Despite his situation. Expose them to who? The cops? The feds? They're all in on it. Jerome turned to him. Not all of them. Sullivan's smirk faded. He had underestimated Jerome before. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. By the time Jerome left the warehouse, the plan was already in motion. Marcus had transferred the files, sending copies to trusted journalists, independent investigators, and even anonymous whistleblower sites. If Sullivan was right, if the entire police force was compromised, then they needed to bypass the system entirely. But Jerome knew one thing for certain. The moment those files became public, hell would break loose. And he was right. The first news report broke at 6 a.m. By noon, it was everywhere. Exclusive. High-ranking police officers linked to illegal drug trade. Evidence reveals corruption in city police force, names listed. WHO can we trust? Community outraged as police scandal unfolds. Sullivan's confession had been broadcast nationwide. The mayor's office scrambled to do damage control. The police chief resigned within hours. And the entire city was now watching. But Jerome knew this wasn't over. Because corrupt men didn't go down without a fight. And when night fell, they came for him. It started with a car parked outside his store, its engine humming quietly in the darkness. Then came the shadows moving across rooftops. The flicker of gun barrels in the moonlight. Marcus saw them first. They're here, he whispered. Jerome grabbed his weapon, his mind switching into combat mode. Then, the gunfire began. Windows shattered. Bullets ripped through the walls. Jerome and Marcus dove for cover. Stay low, Jerome barked. The attack was precise, methodical. These weren't street thugs. These were trained killers. The police department was cleaning house. Jerome and Marcus moved fast, returning fire, taking down the first wave of attackers. But more kept coming. Lisa and Kayla were hidden in a safe house, but if Jerome didn't survive the night, they would be next. This wasn't just about winning. It was about surviving. Marcus tossed a flashbang. Jerome used the distraction to take out 2 more shooters. But they were outnumbered. And that's when the unexpected happened. Sirens. But not from corrupt cops. From the FBI. The government had been watching the news. And they had come to clean up the mess. The last thing Jerome saw before everything exploded into chaos was Sullivan's panicked face as his own people turned on him. The war had ended. But Jerome? Jerome wasn't finished yet. Smoke still curled from the bullet-riddled walls of Carter's corner store as dawn painted the sky in deep shades of orange and red. The battle had been won. But the war had left scars, on the city, on the people, and on Jerome himself. He sat on the curb outside, his muscles aching, his mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours like a war film stuck on repeat. His store was a ruin. His home, gone. The safe life he had built after the Marines had burned to the ground. Just like the memories of the men he had buried in foreign lands. Lisa and Kayla were safe. That was all that mattered. Marcus emerged from the wreckage, wiping soot and blood from his face. The feds cleaned house. He muttered, "Sullivan's in custody. O'Connor, Reynolds, and Draper? Either dead or locked up. The entire police force is under investigation." Jerome exhaled slowly. "And the chief?" Marcus shook his head. "Didn't make it. Tried to run. His own guys turned on him." Jerome wasn't surprised. This city had been rotting from the inside out for years. Sullivan and his crew were just symptoms of a disease that had spread through its veins. And Jerome? He had become the scalpel that cut the sickness out. A black SUV pulled up to the crime scene. Two men in dark suits stepped out, flashing their FBI badges. The older one, a seasoned agent with a hardened face, approached Jerome. "You Carter?" Jerome nodded. The agent crouched beside him. "You made some powerful enemies," he said, "but you also did this city a favor." Jerome wasn't sure if that was true. He had fought, bled, and nearly died to expose the truth. But at what cost? His business? His peace? The agent continued, "We'll offer you protection, witness relocation, if you want it." Jerome met his gaze. "I'm not running." The agent smirked. "Didn't think you would." He stood up and nodded to his partner. "Stay out of trouble, Carter. You've done enough damage for one lifetime." And with that, the FBI disappeared into the morning light. Jerome watched them go, knowing the fight wasn't truly over. There were still shadows in the city. And if no one else was willing to fight them, he would. It had been 3 weeks since the battle at Carter's corner store. The city was still reeling from the fall of its corrupt police force. Sullivan and his crew were on trial. Their dirty dealings plastered across every news station. People in power were scrambling, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. Jerome had spent the time rebuilding, not just his store, but his life. The first time he returned to what was left of Carter's corner. His heart ached. The bullet holes in the walls, the burn marks on the floor. It wasn't just a store, it had been a symbol of his new beginning. And now, it was a graveyard of what once was. Lisa stood beside him, holding Kayla's hand. "You don't have to stay here," she said softly. "We could leave, start over somewhere new." Jerome thought about it, thought about packing up and disappearing. But that wasn't who he was. He looked around, at the people of the neighborhood who had been terrorized for years by men like Sullivan. They had trusted him, respected him. He couldn't just walk away. He placed his hands on his daughter's shoulders, crouching to look her in the eyes. "This is our home," he said, "and we don't run from home." Lisa sighed but nodded. She understood. Jerome turned to Marcus. "Let's rebuild." Marcus grinned. "Damn right." And just like that, the soldier in him returned. By the time the new Carter's corner store opened, the city had changed. With the police force purged, the government scrambled to restore order. New officers were being sworn in, men and women who actually cared about justice. But Jerome knew better than to put his faith in a system that had already failed him once. He wasn't done fighting. Word had spread about what he had done. People started coming to him, not just for groceries, but for help. A mother who had been threatened by a gangster who used to be protected by Sullivan's crew. A young man who had been framed by dirty cops still lurking in the shadows. A local business owner being shaken down by a new wave of criminals trying to fill the power vacuum. Jerome listened. And then? He acted. One by one, he took down the remnants of the corruption that still poisoned his city. He used the skills the Marines had taught him. And soon, a new name began to circulate in the underworld. The ghost of the Marine. A shadow that protected the innocent. And the people? They started calling him something else. Not just a store owner. Not just a soldier. But a guardian. The night was cold, the air thick with the scent of rain and gasoline. Jerome stood on a rooftop, watching as one last piece of the old regime fell. A corrupt city councilman, a man who had worked with Sullivan for years, was caught trying to flee with dirty money. The authorities had him now. This was the last loose end. Marcus stood beside him, arms crossed. "You did it." Jerome didn't respond immediately. He simply watched as the police, clean cops this time, put the councilman in cuffs. Marcus nudged him. So what now? Jerome took a deep breath. This war had cost him everything. But in the end, it had been worth it. He turned to his old friend. We keep going. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You sure? Jerome nodded. There's always gonna be another Sullivan. Another man in power who thinks he can get away with hurting people. And as long as that's true. He pulled his hood over his head, disappearing into the night. I'm not done. The war was over. But Jerome Carter? He had just begun.